You're listening to Online Pet Health Podcasts with Dr. Megan Kelly. Continuing education for veterinarian rehabilitation therapists. Learn more at onlinepethealth.com.
Hey vet rehabbers, today we are looking at a training on our hydrotherapy membership, but it's actually applicable to all our vet rehabbers. The topic is how to handle pet bereavement, and it's lectured by Emma Jane LaRoche. Grollman said the only cure for grief is to grieve. Emma shares with us the different ways in which grief can grip and affect us. This training will really help us to recognize and understand grief in ourselves as well as in our clients, and also give us the tools to better navigate that path that is before us and support our clients in doing the same. Please know that if any of you are going through a difficult time in your grieving, you're not alone. Please reach out to us. We can help you get some guidance and support. You can always email me at meg@onlinepethealth.com. For those of you that are members of our free limited access membership, we have just changed the free webinars. So the small animal one is Diagnosis and Non-Surgical Management of Digit Injuries in Dogs by Jennifer Brown. In our paid membership, we have 202 hours of small animal vet rehab specific learning now. In the hydrotherapy free membership, there is now Gait Assessment for Canine Hydrotherapy Patients by Amy Kings. And in our paid membership, 101 hours now of hydrotherapy specific training. For the free webinar in the Equine platform, it's going to be How TAC Influences Movement by Lauren Bergbeck. And we have 136 hours now in the Equine paid membership. So if you're not signed up already, you can go to onlinepethealth.com/free. So over to Emma Jane to learn more about how we can handle pet bereavement.
Hello and welcome to my presentation on pet bereavement and the different types of grief. My name is Emma Jane LaRoche. I'm a counsellor. I deal with all kinds of mental health issues. I work privately and I also work with NHS clients. But one of my particular interests is working with pet bereavement. So, what is grief? Grief is a natural response to loss. It's the emotional response we have to loss. And we can also feel it physiologically and cognitively. So, for example, we may find that we're not eating. We may find that we're not able to sleep. It's actually a very individual experience, and it depends on many factors, including our family history, environment, and personality. To give you a little bit more information on this, the first loss we actually experience is when we leave the womb. The first 2 years of our life shape how we establish ourselves physically and emotionally, and how we actually create our own emotional style and our own emotional resources, where we learn to manage our feelings, our reactions to others, and our actual reactions to stress. If we have endured early stress and trauma or early attachment issues when we've been an infant with our primary carer, which is usually our mums, this can actually have an impact on how we grieve later on in life. For anybody that wants to understand more about the attachment theoretical model, I would suggest looking up a gentleman called John Bowlby. He is actually recognised as the originator of this particular theory. So why do we grieve? So grieving is a process we go through to help us get used to the fact that the attachment object or our pet is no longer available. It helps us to come to terms with the loss of the individual pet that we had a relationship with. We grieve for that love that we've lost. So why do we get attached to our pets? And why is that attachment so strong? So there are various reasons. They're unconditional. They're accepting, they're non-judgmental, they're comforting, they're reassuring, they're companionship, they are a form of stability and a form of support. So our animals give us structure, they give us something to nurture, to care about, give us, particularly elderly people, a reason for getting up in the morning, something to care for, helping people through loneliness. So on this slide, I've actually listed some common reactions we have to losing a pet. So affective reactions: fear, pain, emptiness, isolation, the initial shock, and feeling silly for grieving a pet, emptiness, anxiety, and anger. The physiological reactions include loss of appetite, crying, lethargy and restlessness, sleeplessness. And the cognitive reactions are sense-making, idealization, sharing of memories, searching behavior, knowledge seeking and processing. And in fact, when you actually see these reactions, that you see that they are also common to losing a human being. So there are various types of grief models, phases of grief models, but in this particular instance, I'm going to show you some of the phases of grief that were devised by John Bowlby and Colin Parkes. So, as well as being able to relate to this human loss, it also relates to how we feel when we lose an animal. These include shock and numbness, yearning and searching, disorganisation and despair, reorganisation and recovery. So shock and numbness being that initial shock of when our pet dies. The yearning and searching may be that expectation of seeing that dog walk through the door, or thinking you may have caught them out the corner of your eye. The disorganisation and despair, that complete utter sadness and despair that you're going to be unable to see them again. And the reorganisation and recovery is about having that new life without that individual. So another model we use is by W.J. Warden. This is where we move on to the different tasks of grief. So this is about exploring how we journey and process the grief. We realise that our pet is no longer alive and fully accepting we will never see them again. Processing the vast array of emotions we feel at the death of our pet, experiencing the pain of this loss and being able to express these emotions fully and safely. We learn to cater to a world where our pet is no longer alive and available to us, and adjusting to that new life, that new identity, and being aware we won't be getting up in the early hours of the morning when our pet scratches at the door to be let out. Finally, we reach a place where we can reflect on our memories, but go on to live a full and meaningful life. So this is a particular model or picture that I use when speaking with clients. And in it you can see there's a whirlpool. We go along in the river of life and suddenly we hit this waterfall and we end up in this complete whirlpool of emotions. Completely lost, we're being washed up to different beaches, onto the rocks, and it's a complete and utter whirlwind of emotions, or whirlpool of emotions I should say. Some of the emotions we'll experience is the denial, the bargaining, wishing that we could do anything to get that pet back, depression, acceptance, numbness, the despair, the hopelessness, the loneliness, the guilt that we feel when we're experiencing grief. So the first type of grief I'd like to refer to is disenfranchised grief. So this is a grief that a person experiences when they incur loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly mourned. This was a grief that came about from Ken Doka, noticing that there are, with disenfranchised grief, it's a particular grief where basically people can't talk about it. It's not allowed. This could range from suicide, it could range to a miscarriage, but in particular, it's also relevant to pet bereavement. So family and friends may not understand why someone would grieve so much for a pet. So if you've ever experienced that situations where it basically hasn't been recognised, nobody gets the fact that you were so deeply attached to your pet. There may be a time limit to grief for the loss or deceased pet, so why aren't you over it? You should be over it by now. It's only, it's a week gone by or it's a month gone by. They should be over it by now. Also, our own embarrassment and shame at grieving so much for a pet. People are often surprised about how deeply they were attached to their pet and how much they actually feeling that loss. We may experience people, family, friends saying just go and buy yourself a new pet. So they don't quite get it. They don't understand how attached you were to your pet, that it can't simply be replaced. Sometimes people may experience guilt at grieving more for a pet than a human being or even a family member. People again are often surprised at that, how much they grieve for their pet. And some people will actually say that they have grieved more for their pets than they have for their mother or father. The lack of ritual or public mourning when grieving for a pet. So, imagine that there was no somebody that you knew died. There was the usual funeral, there were the sympathy cards, there were the flowers, there was the acknowledgement and recognition this was going to take you time to grieve. Well, often nothing happens like that for a pet, and that's hard, that's tough. And it may be judged or seen as something which should not be openly grieved for. It's just not acceptable to be grieving so much for a pet. And those of us that have experienced will just get over it. There was recently a young lady in Scotland whose pet died. She phoned her employer to say that she wouldn't be in for work because she was completely devastated at the loss of her pet. However, she didn't get a particularly good experience from her employer. In fact, her employer sacked her because she didn't turn up for work. And since then, there's actually been a petition on Facebook to get pet bereavement recognised by employers. So the next grief I'm going to talk about is ambiguous grief. So this is a grief without closure or wishes unresolved. Ambiguous grief is a term used to describe a grief which is never resolved, knowing that perhaps a lost or stolen pet may be out there, but having no idea whether it's okay, if still alive, or if we'll ever see it again. Those who hand a dog into rescue through no fault of the dog's own, or even in the personal circumstances of the owner. It's that never knowing if it had a good home or not, never knowing maybe in years to come if it's still alive, if it's passed. This can be really, really difficult for people. So what happens when there's an ambiguous grief? Well, there are the usual emotions for grief, but our emotions can also fluctuate, and 1 minute we can be up, 1 minute we can be down. It's that never knowing, that hope that's there, and then suddenly it's gone. And that is a continuous state of feeling up and down. The impact can be physically and emotionally traumatizing and exhausting. And it can also lead to bouts of depression and anxiety. There is no closure, that never knowing what's happened to that pet. Now, recently there has been a situation in Sweden. In fact, just last year, there was a competitor in the World Agility Championships from Colombia, and her Sheltie actually went missing. And that Sheltie is still missing. They have a Facebook page at the moment which is collecting donations to keep people looking out for that little dog. So that dog's been out there a year, but you can only imagine what emotions that owner's going through for their little dog. 1 minute they've seen it, then there'll be periods when it hasn't been seen. So I did a little bit of research recently for this presentation to find out, the amount of missing dogs that we have. And missing pets in general. So Petlog, which is part of the Kennel Club, reported that between May 2003 and May 2014, so that's over the period of 11 years, there were 16,122 dogs and 55,038 cats reported missing and have yet to be reunited with their owners. So those figures may have changed. They may now have been returned. I know we hear in the news sometimes about dogs or cats that have been missing for years and reunited. But during that same time, more than 60,000 dogs and over 100,000 cats were reported missing. These are UK stats, and it was also noticed that it's the south of England that reports the most amount of missing pets. Issues include the fact, though, that add to these numbers, the fact that many people don't think about updating their microchip details. So this can be a major cause of why some of these dogs and cats aren't actually reunited with their owners. Anticipatory grief. So that's about knowing that a pet is going to die through old age or illness. It's that waiting, it's knowing that it's going to happen. Our emotions fluctuate. We often think about what life is going to be like without that pet. We have an elderly dog perhaps, or an ill dog, and it's that knowing that it is eventually going to happen, and we start to grieve. And guilt is a common reaction in grief. However, with anticipatory grief, there will be a wish to see the suffering end, but it would also mean an end to that life. So there's a dilemma, there's some confusion there. So we know that a decision is going to have to be made at some point, but we know also and feel that responsibility that we're the ones that have to make that decision of knowing when is the right time to say goodbye to our pets. So not knowing when to make that decision, that can be difficult. And for all of us, we think, have we done the right thing? Have we waited too long? When would be the right time? What could we do for our pets to make that journey easier? And those feelings of guilt that actually maybe we picked the wrong time, or we did leave it too long. So the final grief I'm going to mention in my talk today is complicated grief. So this is when our normal grieving process has been interrupted or impacted by some unresolved feelings and emotions we previously had to cope with. We may have a feeling of stuckness. As an example to this, it may be feelings of guilt regarding the euthanasia of our pet. Did we make the right decision or not? It's very individual. It happens when we have been impacted by something else. So there may have been a recent death in the family that impacts on us. So we basically get a double whammy. If we've had a grief recently, then the loss of our pet, then it's difficult. It's difficult trying to cope with those when we still haven't processed that previous grief. We may become isolated, or sometimes even feel that life is not worth living anymore, and we may go into some form of deep depression. Complicated grief is also, apart from maybe losses that we've experienced previously with our pets, which can impact. It can also be influenced by our childhood. There may be history of a traumatic childhood. There may be, it can be down to our family history. It's all very, very personal and very individual, the way we grieve. There may be things that we're experiencing currently. There may be changes in our life, or there may be a divorce going on. There may be job changes. There may be other stresses that have actually impacted on the natural process of grief, which unfortunately can make us feel stuck in one particular part of that grieving process. So to summarize, one of the quotes I like to use with my clients is in fact that the only way and the only cure for grief is to grieve.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button so you get notified every time I load a new podcast. I'm here every week talking to vet rehab therapists from all over the world about all things vet rehab. Don't forget to bookmark the next Vet Rehab Summit on Saturday, the 4th of November. Come and be a part of the world's largest online veterinary rehabilitation conference created specifically for you, the vet rehabber community. Onlinepethealth members get VIP complimentary access to the Vet Rehab Summit. For more information about continuing education for vet rehabbers, you can go to onlinepethealth.com.